Dr. Ches Thurber is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Northern Illinois University. His research examines the range of contentious global politics from nonviolent resistance movements to interstate war. His book manuscript, Between Mao and Gandhi, Strategies of Violence and Nonviolence in Revolutionary Movements, investigates variation in the strategic behavior of groups seeking to capture state power. Findings from his research were featured on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Big Ideas radio program. Previous work has been published in Small Wars and Insurgencies, the Journal of Public and International Affairs, and Al-Maqla. Previously, Dr. Thurber was a research fellow at the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism at the University of Chicago and at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He received his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and his BA from Middlebury College. And with that, I will now pass full control over to Dr. Thurber.
Thank you so much, David, for that kind introduction, and thank you to ICNC for hosting this webinar. I'm really looking forward to presenting some of my work, and especially to the questions and discussion that I hope will follow with all of you who are joining online. So most importantly, thank you for all of you who are here virtually in attendance. So yeah, again, my name is Ches Thurber, and I'm an assistant professor in the Political Science Department at Northern Illinois University. And I'm writing a book on how resistance movements come to see civil resistance as a viable option or not, focusing on how their social support network could affect their perceptions of really the relative viability of a strategy of nonviolent civil resistance versus armed insurgency. And one of my findings through this research is that there are particular challenges for movements that are trying to organize civil resistance campaigns in divided societies. And so in today's webinar, I want to try to explain why I think that's the case, to explore some of these obstacles in 3 specific cases: Nepal, East Timor, and South Africa, and to begin to brainstorm and evaluate some of the strategies that movements can employ or consider employing in such a context when they're operating in a divided society. So here's kind of my agenda for today. I want to start off by thinking theoretically about the strategic logic of civil resistance, building on many of the works that many of you, I think, are already familiar with: Gene Sharp, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, Kurt Schock, Sharon Nepstead, and others. Think about how they argue why and how civil resistance works, and the ways in which that might be applied in divided societies, and how divided societies might present particular challenges to the mechanisms towards nonviolent success that they highlight. I'll then turn to a more in-depth case study of Gandhians and Maoists in Nepal. I conducted 3 summers worth of field research in Nepal. These Nepali cases are the crux of my, my book project. And I'll give you a spoiler alert up front. One of the things that I think makes this really interesting is that the Gandhians take up arms and the Maoists put them down and employ nonviolent resistance. They both actually use both strategies at different points in time, but I think what makes it interesting is the fact that both are willing to do the opposite of what their ideological predisposition would suggest. I'm then going to move on to talk about East Timor and South Africa. These are cases that I've encountered more recently and I'm a little bit less familiar with. But I've started to think more about them, and I think they're particularly interesting from the standpoint of thinking about strategies that movements use when they are in the context of a divided society to try to overcome some of these obstacles that I'm going to discuss first. And then again, I'm hoping to leave plenty of time at the end for questions and discussions. I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about the obstacles that divided societies face for civil resistance, and it's more recently that I've started thinking about what the different strategies and techniques that movements could use, the potential solutions to these problems are. And so I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts, your evaluations of some of the solutions I proposed, additional solutions that I haven't yet thought of. So I want to start off with kind of an empirical puzzle. And that is some of our classic cases of civil resistance, the ones that are most frequently just talked about in normal discourse, studied academically, are ones that did occur in divided societies, where specifically the group that was resisting kind of comes from a different social, ethnic, religious background, racial background. than those against whom they are resisting. Thinking of Gandhi's movement in India, anti-Apartheid movement in Africa, U.S. civil rights movement. And yet, despite the fact that these are some of the most prominent cases, when we look at kind of the cross-national data sets of cases of civil resistance, we find that these cases are actually relatively rare. So one of the things I went through in my research was to look at the NAVCO data set that looks at both violent and non-violent campaigns, and to look at which of those campaigns occurred across specifically ethnic lines or not. That is, in which campaigns do we see the resistors coming from one ethnic group fighting against a regime that comes from primarily from a different ethnic group. This is something that Civil War scholars have paid attention to for a long time and had come up with similar classifications. So when I take a look at the NAVCO data set, I find that of the civil wars in that data set, 52% play out across ethnic lines. 52%, over half, is the group that is fighting the insurgency, recruiting primarily from a different ethnic group than those who have access to power in government, those who make up the elite positions of the state. And this is consistent, as I said, other Civil War scholars have done similar things using different data sets, and everyone seems to come up with a pretty similar figure, something around 50%, usually north of 50%. By contrast, when I do the same type of analysis looking at the civil resistance campaigns in the NAVCO data set, only 13% play out along ethnic lines. This is buttressed by another finding by a different set of researchers, Svensson and Lindgren, who published an article in 2011 showing that of these cases, of the nonviolent cases which play out along ethnic lines, they succeed at a much lower rate than the ones that don't play out on ethnic lines. So again, this is not comparing violence to nonviolence. This is looking just at the nonviolent campaigns. The ones in which there is this major social cleavage or ethnic cleavage dividing the movement from the regime, the adversary, they are succeeding less often than when such a cleavage is not present. So this is kind of the main figure, quantitative finding from my paper, showing that ethnic groups are more likely to choose violence over nonviolence when they are excluded from the regime, or conversely, they're less likely to choose nonviolence when they are excluded from the regime. And then it also takes the form of the size of the ethnic group as well. If they are a larger ethnic group, they're more likely to choose nonviolence. If they are a smaller ethnic group, they're more likely to turn to arms. Perhaps more intuitively, we can think about this in a series of cases such as the Arab Spring. Whereas we saw in some of the more homogeneous societies, Tunisia and Egypt, the primary mode of resistance was primarily nonviolent civil resistance. But in the cases of divided societies where there were major sectarian or tribal cleavages, Syria, Libya, Yemen, we saw the movements either immediately or over time abandon nonviolence in favor of violence. So what's going on here? I think that there are both psychological as well as strategic barriers to civil resistance in divided societies. So the psychological argument focuses on kind of theories of social psychology about the other, and this general idea, which I think has been substantiated in, or found repeatedly in social psychology literature, that the more in which individuals see other individuals as a member of another group, the more likely they are to see the use of violence against them as appropriate, justifiable. The history of some of these studies dates back to the infamous Stanley Milgram shock experiments. Kind of later variants of that tried the same idea of when are individuals willing to inflict pain on somebody else, and try it with when the subject is of a different race, when they wear a different type of clothes, and find, for example, that when these differences exist, the subjects are willing to inflict more pain on the other. Thankfully, we have institutional review boards, and those experiments are no longer allowed to be conducted, even though they were fake. Nobody was actually hurt. There's quite a bit of psychological harm done to those who participated in the experiments, just that they were willing to inflict pain. So this kind of psychological barrier builds on this. There are some more practical examples. Christian Davenport has done the study of repression in protests in the United States and finds when you have black protesters and white police, that's more likely to lead to violence. And there's another strain of this literature that emphasizes how certain types of grievances are more likely to trigger violent emotional responses. Specific kind that's mentioned are called horizontal inequalities, when economic inequalities generally follow the patterns of racial, ethnic, or other divisions. That type of grievance creates a type of emotional reaction that's different than other types of grievances. If you're just upset about your lack of political rights or civil liberties, that is more likely to lead to violence. But I think the rationale may go beyond just the psychological explanations. I think there are strategic explanations as well. As I mentioned, if we start thinking about the way in which civil resistance works according to the rich scholarship we have on that subject, we see that the presence of social cleavages, social divisions, may affect that strategic logic of nonviolent action. For example, we know that kind of the number one thing in order for movements to be successful is that they need to generate mass mobilization. But if you are operating in a divided society, generating mass mobilization might be more difficult. You need to bridge the various different factions within the society. These social differences may make it more difficult to bridge those divisions, may make it more difficult for members of other groups to empathize, to identify with your cause, and show up in the street, to be willing to engage in that kind of high-risk behavior for your cause. Additionally, the strategic logic of nonviolent action points to the importance of loyalty shifts from the regime. Members of the regime defecting and joining the side of the protesters. We know that that generally works when there are close personal ties between members of the protest movement and members of the regime. If there are major social cleavages between the regime and the protest movement, we might think that those loyalty shifts are less likely to happen. And finally, the cost of repression to the regime. We think that when a movement is protesting nonviolently, it's going to be more difficult for the regime to engage in violent repression of that movement. It'll be more difficult in two ways, that we think that the security forces themselves will be less willing to obey orders to open fire on the regime, that they will have some type of psychological, emotional cost barrier to doing so. I argue that that may be less likely to be the case when there is a social division between those security forces and the protesters. Again, this kind of is underpinned again by the logic of, by some of this the social psychology literature. But I think it is different as well. And I think the importance of this, the difference is that even in a case where we're thinking of movement leaders who are doing their best to constrain kind of psychological incentives that might push themselves or their movement to violence, they are still constrained by the behavior of their adversary as well as potential allies in their conflict environment. And so when they're assessing the viability of engaging in nonviolent civil resistance, these dynamics might make them more skeptical that they're going to be able to do the things that they need to do, that the literature shows need to happen in order for nonviolence to work. So I want to try to show this in action in 3 different cases that I explained, thinking about both how these social divisions within these societies created special challenges for nonviolent resistors in those countries, and the different strategies that those movements employed to try to overcome those obstacles. Again, my point here isn't to be pessimistic and say by any means that nonviolent civil resistance does not work in divided societies. My point is to say that these groups may be right that there are specific obstacles, specific challenges that they face that are not present in less divided societies, and that we need to do more rigorous and careful thinking about things that they can do to overcome those barriers. So the first case that I want to talk about today is the case of Nepal. And the map I'm showing here, you hear in the presentation, is a social map of Nepal. I think it's primarily an ethnic map showing the different groups that speak different languages within Nepal. But ethnicity, religion, caste, and even region form different types of social barriers in Nepal that overlap, cross-cut, and create a very complex social picture. Add to this the topography of Nepal being very mountainous. And the point that I want you to take away, I think mostly from this map, is that you're looking at a society in which there are many small different social groups around the country separated by tall mountains, that I think is creates the classic case of a divided society, in which a movement is going to have to think about ways of bringing together all these various different social groups around the country into one unified movement. And sure enough, for the group that I'm going to discuss today that try to do this, this presents a very difficult challenge. So the first group that I want to talk about are called the Nepali Congress. They take their name from India's Congress Party, because who they were a group of kind of Nepali elites who were living in exile in India. They had fled Nepal because of the repressive political system there. They had gone to India. And in India, they study under Gandhi. They participate in the Quit India movement. They become fully indoctrinated in this idea of satyagraha. They believe that this holds tremendous potential for achieving political liberation, achieving political change. And so once India achieves its independence, they have the idea that they want to now go back to Nepal and employ the same repertoires that they were participated in India, in Nepal, in order to overthrow the Rana autocratic regime and to institute a democracy in Nepal. But they encounter several obstacles. They're not able to coordinate collective action amongst all these diverse social groups in Nepal. Particularly, timeline, we're talking about late 1940s at this point. So not only do you have these this kind of patchwork of different social groups across Nepal, but it's difficult to create communication and interaction between them. When there's such limited technology, they speak different languages, so just printing documents out and sharing them becomes very difficult unless you're able to translate them into all of these different languages. Even if you could, literacy rates are quite low, so it really needs to be kind of verbal communication to spread the message of who the Nepali Congress Party is, what it is they stand for, and to encourage others to get out in the street and support their cause. They're ultimately not able to do so. We see in the writings of B.P. Korala, who is pictured in the top right, spent some time in prison writing diaries, and he's just exasperated at the inability of his movement to generate mass mobilization in Nepal. They call for a protest, but nobody shows up in the streets. This campaign basically ends in late 1949. The leaders of the party get together in Calcutta, India, have kind of a secret meeting in this movie theater that's owned by one of their members, and they debate, can we keep going forward with a nonviolent strategy in Nepal? Is this going to work? They make arguments for and against, and they actually have a vote, and it ends up being kind of a 2-to-1 in favor of what's technically revising their group's constitution, their platform, taking out that we're going to use exclusively nonviolent means and replacing it with language that they're going to use all available means. And what they actually do is launch an armed insurgency in early 1950. That armed insurgency ends up being relatively effective. They overthrow the monarchy with, the dictatorship with Indian support, instate a constitutional monarchy with a parliament, but after about 10 years, the king is able to basically shut down the democratic part of the constitutional monarchy and make it more or less an absolute monarchy. The Nepali Congress goes underground, and for about 30 years, they engage in a process of movement building. India is not willing to support them in any kind of future armed insurgency, so that option is kind of off the table. So the only thing they see available to them is to try to do something to extend their reach to all these diverse groups within Nepal. So they spend 30 years operating as an underground organization, creating all kinds of different parallel organizations to bring together students based on different professions, women's organizations, all these kind of different fronts of the underground Nepali Congress Party. The idea of finding kind of cross-cutting ties to bring together members of all these different ethnic and caste groups across Nepal. The upshot is that when political opportunities emerged later in 1979 and 1990 to engage in nonviolent civil resistance, they are much better prepared to take advantage of those opportunities, and they are ultimately successful in 1990, overthrowing, forcing the king to reinstate the democratic system, reinstate parliament. With the Maoists in Nepal, we actually see somewhat of a similar storyline, though later in time. In the early 1990s, under more or less democratic Nepal, the Nepal's Maoists are trying to organize, but their base of support is limited to one specific ethnic community, the Magar community in the central Nepal hills. They are unable to build support outside of this community. They even attempt some type of protest nonviolent action, and they're not able to get anyone to participate. They call for a general strike in Kathmandu, and they actually have to resort to throwing Molotov cocktails at buses, using violent intimidation to get others to go along with their supposedly nonviolent strike. In 1994, they launch an armed insurgency. Ends up being quite successful. They're able to take control of a substantial portion of the Nepali countryside. In so doing, they engage in a little bit of movement building as well. They create organizations similar to what the Nepali Congress did, trying to bring together this different patchwork of ethnic groups that they now govern through their conquest and civil war. But more importantly, there's a series of events, a palace massacre in which the king is killed in 2001, gets replaced by another king who then starts undermining some of the democratic reforms in Nepal, such that the other political parties turn away from the monarchy and look to the Maoists to try to seek an alliance. So the meeting in Delhi in 2005, and the Maoists are able to form a coalition with the other political parties, the outcome of which is they say they're going to all join together in a joint civil resistance campaign that's going to begin in 2006. That when the Maoists are able to form a coalition with other actors, spread the reach of their support, most importantly, get membership from the different groups that have those ties with the regime, with the state, that are going to be essential for nonviolence to be effective, that's what enables the Maoist leaders to go back to their supporters and say, hey, we can stop waging war, we can make this transition to nonviolent action, and we think that it might actually work. Turning now to a different case of Indonesia. Again, I'm bringing up a map that is intended to kind of reflect the map that you saw recently of Nepal. Another highly divided society in terms of just an incredible diversity of different ethnic and religious groups living in the country of Indonesia. In this map, seems to be from before East Timor was annexed in the 1970s, or perhaps it's from after it gained its independence. But it's down kind of in the middle bottom right as the one white spot in the mix of all the colors. And whereas Nepal had the geographic barrier of all these different mountain ranges dividing the groups, here in Indonesia we have an archipelago, all these different islands separating the groups. And in terms of East Timor's independence, we see some of the same barriers to action. Sorry, it looks like my photo is kind of blocking some of the text here. But what happens is in 1975, when East Timor is gaining its independence from Portugal, it is invaded and annexed by Suharto's Indonesia. East Timor itself is quite diverse. There are many different social groups within East Timor, but beyond those kind of more fine-grained divisions, there are also kind of some larger cleavages that separate the population of East Timor from central Jakarta, Indonesia, whether it's the primacy of Catholicism as the religion in East Timor, whereas the rest of Indonesia is primarily Muslim, and there's Mobere versus Indonesia, kind of a macro identity classification. The people of East Timor viewed themselves as socially distinct from those who held kind of the elite positions in the capital of Jakarta, and vice versa. Initial resistance efforts were plagued by fragmentation. Those different kind of diverse groups within East Timor couldn't organize collectively. The government was able to kind of play one off of the other. An armed resistance led by a group called Falantil emerges, but is relatively quickly defeated by the Indonesian state. In the wake of that, a new group, the CNRM, emerges and tries instead to employ non-violent methods, a strategy of civil resistance. Again, the social divisions between the members of the CNRM and the members of the Indonesian state make it easy for the Indonesian regime to engage in quite severe repression, most notably a massacre on November 12th of 1991. So how does the NCRM, CNRM respond? Sorry, the difference in the acronyms here is based on different translations of the name of the group. As opposed to Falantil, the CNRM drops their Marxist ideology to try to appeal to get support from the Catholic Church and to be more marketable in the international community, to try to win support from Western governments. They thought they weren't going to be able to do so if they maintained kind of this Marxist ideology for what they wanted an independent East Timorese state to look like. They also targeted internationally televised events and foreign embassies, a specific goal of trying to internationalize the conflict. They did not think that on their own they could inflict sufficient coercion upon the Indonesian regime in order to achieve their independence. Maria Stephan calls the strategy extending the battlefield. What they tried to do was to appeal to external actors for them to intervene, to put pressure on the Indonesian state to grant independence for East Timor. They also engaged in coalition building, in this case in the late 1990s with the movement to try to overthrow Suharto. There the goal wasn't independence for the East Timorese state, the goal of that movement was to end the Suharto's dictatorship. But the CNRM made the strategic decision to ally with that movement, to be a part of that effort in the hope that in the aftermath they could then lobby for their own independence. They're eventually successful with, in the face of some severe repression, but with the help and intervention of the United Nations. And finally, I want to focus on South Africa's anti-apartheid movement. This case is a little bit different than the others. Now, we're not thinking of kind of a patchwork of many different ethnic groups. Black South Africans have the ability to generate mass mobilization. They have power in numbers. However, the structure of the regime means that there are few opportunities for loyalty shifts. And in the South African, the apartheid regime is able to get their security forces to engage in pretty brutal repression, most notably the photo there of the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. As with Nepal's Maoists and Falantil, this leads some actors to see armed action as the only way out. We have the kind of competing trends of groups using violent and nonviolent tactics throughout the 70s and 80s. We've seen an upswing in civil resistance in the 1980s, with groups employing new strategies. So what are the different things that Black South Africans are able to do to try to overcome this obstacle of a major racial cleavage between the movement and the regime? One, overwhelming mobilization. Take advantage of their powers and numbers. This is not an obstacle for them. Use the power numbers to undermine key pillars of support. Try to overcome the obstacle over other obstacles through just overwhelming mobilization. This involves some movement building and coalitions as well. Different groups organizing and working together to maximize their mobilization efforts. It's also evidence of the strategy of fraternization. Tactics trying to emphasize common identities to bridge across social divides. Try to overcome the psychological dimension of seeing members of other groups as an other, trying to convert them, winning them over to your side, emphasizing kind of your common humanity. And finally, there was a strong international component to the anti-apartheid movement. Campaigns of boycotts and sanctions against the apartheid regime, again trying to, as Maria Stephan says, extend the battlefield by getting other actors involved who can help overcome some of these divides or make up for some of the challenges the movement is facing by providing external sources of coercion and pressure. So a quick recap of the cases. I've listed each of the 4 cases here, as well as the barriers to civil resistance that operating in their particular divided societies cause them to face. For Nepali Congress and East Timor, it was a struggle to generate mass mobilization. The Maoists to some degree as well. They couldn't win over loyalty shifts from the regime. And both the East Timor case and South Africa case faced massive and pretty severe violent repression. What strategies did they use to overcome those barriers? For Nepali Congress, it was primarily a strategy of movement building. They were able to bridge together many different groups within their society through the creation of these organizations. But this is a very long process. It takes them 30 to 40 years of movement building until they have an organization, a movement that they think is capable of effective nonviolent action. Nepali Maoists are able to do it more quickly, largely through forming a coalition with other political parties. So this has the advantage of being quicker, but it also requires the other political parties to be willing to join the Maoists and to share their political goals. Kind of an external act, this kind of random event of the Palace Massacre that enables this coalition to eventually form. In East Timor, we saw coalition politics as well as internationalization. And in South Africa, we saw a combination of really all of the 5 strategies that I've mentioned today. So that got me thinking kind of with each of these strategies, what are the different advantages that they bring and the risks? Because I think all of these strategies come at some cost. As I mentioned before, the advantage of movement building is that it can be successful in overcoming some of these barriers, and it's not so dependent on the role of outside actors that coalition building or internationalization are. However, as we saw within the Nepali Congress, it can take a really long time. It might mean foregoing a certain window of political opportunity when it arises and having to forego achieving your political goals for years into the future because you need to engage in clandestine movement building first. Coalition building, by contrast, offers a potentially faster way to cross those social barriers. You don't have to build the movement yourself. You can form alliances with other groups who draw members from those different social groups. But this requires you to share some political goals with your coalition partners. If your coalition partners don't share your views, which in a divided society can be more frequent, then it's more difficult. You may have to compromise your own political goals in order to build, to form that alliance. Internationalization can greatly increase your ability to inflict pressure on the regime. You can constrain the regime's ability to repress you. And it seemed to be effective in the 2 cases that I talked about today where it was employed. In Sharon Nepsted's excellent book, she points out that there are some drawbacks to internationalization that we see in other cases. That it can actually backfire by undermining the legitimacy of the movement. That if the regime is able to use the movement's effort at internationalization to portray the movement as anti-nationalist, as being a potential 5th column within the society, it can undermine support for that movement. There's another example from a recent example from Nepal that highlights this. Groups in the Terai region that border India were protesting about 1.5 years ago, and they were able to, with support from the Indian government, block off oil shipments into the country of Nepal. But rather than support the highly coercive act, really brought the economy of Nepal to a standstill. But rather than get the regime to negotiate with the movements in protest, it actually created a backlash where everyone blamed the group for returning to India, saw this as undermining Nepali sovereignty, saw the group as being kind of in cahoots with India, and it backfired. The regime was actually in a strong position to not negotiate with the protesters, and the majority of the Nepali public supported the regime's standing firm. They were willing to suffer through the economic costs because they saw that the opposition movements turned to India for support was so against Nepali nationalism. Other strategies, overwhelming coercion. If your power in numbers can overcome some of the other barriers, doesn't require compromising, doesn't require relying on other actors, but it requires, it's kind of limited to the specific case where you have those power in numbers to begin with. Really the context of a a demographic majority being excluded or oppressed, such as we saw in South Africa. And it can also mean enduring a high degree of repression. And finally, fraternization might be a low-cost way of bridge building. I'm not totally convinced that how effective this strategy might be in the long term. I think it is a useful tactic that just about any movement can use, but whether it's sufficient to really win over loyalty shifts from the regime, to really stop repression when you have protesters and security forces from different ethnic groups, I'm not quite convinced of the evidence of this yet. So in conclusion, I think divided societies create particular obstacles for movements considering civil resistance. This doesn't mean that these groups shouldn't use civil resistance, and it certainly doesn't mean that civil resistance would be less effective than violence in these circumstances. It just means that these groups face specific obstacles, and it requires special attention by those of us interested in the study of civil resistance to figure out what those obstacles are and what are the different types of strategies that movements can employ to try to overcome those obstacles. The case studies that I talked about today suggested 5 different potential strategies. And in the end, all of the groups that I talked about today were able to use those strategies to achieve some success. However, all of those strategies have a downside as well. In putting together the little matrix that I showed before, kind of hoping that there will be kind of one strategy that shows itself to be effective in all the different circumstances. I don't think that's the case. Each one seems to have pros and cons, and it's going to be very context-specific that movements are going to have to make determinations as to which one seems to be the best fit for them in their particular context. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to your questions and comments, and again, a brainstorming session. If there are different dimensions, different strategies, things that I haven't thought of, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Could you elaborate more on sort of the limited efficacy of the fraternization type of strategy? Why do you believe that has such a limited kind of ability to work?
Yeah, I think it's something that tends to be more effective when there are already some type of social tie between the movement and the military. For example, there are lots of reports of fraternization efforts in the case of Tahrir Square in Egypt, of protesters going up and hugging members of the army, of chanting, the people in the army are one, to try to create this effect. And when there are already common ties, when there are often common family members, I think that works quite well. I haven't seen kind of overwhelming evidence that when there is this kind of major racial cleavage like we saw in South Africa or that we saw in the U.S. civil rights movement, that simply engaging in these gestures are enough to stop members of the security forces from opening fire. In those cases, we still tend to see quite a bit of violence inflicted by the members of the regime, by the security forces on the protesters. So I want to be clear when I say I don't think it is ineffective. I think it can help do some work. It can help raise those costs. I just haven't seen a case where kind of on its own this strategy was able to convert the hearts and minds of the other group and cause them to not open fire, to cause members of another group to defect from the regime. If you know of cases where this has kind of on its own worked to that degree, I would love to hear about them and learn about them. It's totally possible that I'm being overly pessimistic about the potential of this strategy.
All right, great, thank you. Somebody else writes, how did any of the movements utilize media and or even social media, although some of these are quite older, but how did movements utilize media and social media to overcome barriers of division in their society?
Yeah, so I think it's important to point out, as the questioner did, the time frame of these, that this is kind of pre-social media era. And in the case of Nepal that I know best, even the later cases are pre kind of mass media. There is not some type of universal media source that is going to reach these different groups. I think one of the things that's interesting about ethnicity beyond the degree that ethnicity is social constructed and seeing members of other groups as the other, that language actually creates a very pragmatic and material barrier to collective action, in that in order to spread your message, you need to speak the language of other groups. And so we saw this as a real obstacle, especially for Nepali Congress. But I do think that in their case, the advent of, well, not really advent so much as the spread of the technology of the radio in Nepal made a big difference. Increase in literacy rates between 1950 and 1990 made a big difference. Corresponding with the increase in literacy rates is an increase in the dissemination of the Nepali language, teaching that in the schools, even in indigenous areas where Nepali language isn't the primary language. So that did help them to overcome these obstacles. East Timorese movement, very sophisticated in this front, but to the degree, from what I've seen, that they used this, it was frequently with an international audience in mind. So to what degree, I've seen little evidence of them able to use media in order to spread their message to other actors within Indonesia. I think part of this, a pretty strong barrier at the time, is that they're operating in the Suharto dictatorship for most of this period of resistance, and so the regime has got pretty tight controls over the media. And so to avoid that, this is part of the internationalization strategy. They're able to use a diaspora in other countries to stage protests outside embassies in other countries, to use the international media to drum up support. But again, the recipient of that, it's not other Indonesians who are then reading those news articles and gaining sympathy to their cause. It's really an international audience, getting people around the world to pay attention to their plight, such that it triggers pressure from other states on the Indonesian regime and pressure from the United Nations for intervention.
All right, great. This next question very much ties in with that. This person says, your presentation assumes the Timorese movement's audience included the greater Indonesian public. I don't think it ever did. Indonesian censorship, for one, prevented that. In terms of Indonesia, the independence movement reached out to progressive Indonesians and to members of the Indonesian elite inside the regime. How does this affect your analysis?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And part of the point, this is a constraint on what and how they are able to do. The idea of generating the type of broad mass mobilization that is traditionally what we think of when we think of the practice of civil resistance. This idea that 3.5%, if you get 3.5% of the population out into the streets, no movement that has done that has ever lost. Well, if you, for the East Timorese movement, getting 3.5% of the Indonesian population out of the streets was inconceivable, right? So much so that it was never their intent to do that because they knew that wasn't a possibility. Instead, they focused, as you described, focusing on these strategies of converting loyalty shifts amongst, progressive elites within the regime who they thought that they could convert. I think that is, potentially an alternative strategy that we could think of, that you might be able to pluck off defections, loyalty shifts from people who just espouse a worldview that is less restricted by these identity barriers. My argument is just that this is a tougher road to hoe for East Timorese in that context than it is for other groups when you have kind of common family ties and other social ties that bridge those who are protesting and those who hold positions of power. Is it kind of building on Anneke Binnendijk's work and those of others, that kind of the key variable for when we see loyalty shifts and defections from the regime are when in the presence of pretty close social ties between members of the regime and members of the resistance movement. And that's more difficult for the East Timorese movement to achieve.
Great. Somebody writes, how did the Nepalese Congress change their fundraising strategy after they decided to take up arms?
Yeah, they had a gift in that India was willing to support their armed movement. So I think my focus is on their decision to abandon abandon nonviolence. And I think that decision was made based on the obstacles they were facing and their inability to carry out to generate mass mobilization. When they decide to take up arms, it becomes easy for them because India is willing to provide them with those arms. Fast forward to 1960, they're facing a similar situation again, where they're kind of booted out of power, want to do something to resist. At that point, the Indian spigot has been turned off because of Indian tensions with China. India becomes cozy with the monarchy in Nepal, doesn't want to support a resistance movement. That's what takes the violent option off the table. So why couldn't Nepali Congress start civil resistance again at that point? I argue it's because they're facing the same social environment that they faced in 1950. They can't tie all these groups together towards nonviolent action, towards mass mobilization. And so their only option at that point is kind of underground movement building. And so they start the process then. It just takes a while for them to get to the point where they have built a sufficiently broad movement. And then it also requires kind of the political opportunity to open up that they want to try to take advantage of, which a small one opens up in 1979 that they attempt protest, and then a larger one in 1990. They're basically trying to piggyback off of the protests that they see going on elsewhere in Southeast Asia in 1988, 1999, and also elsewhere, obviously in Europe as well at that time.
All right, great. Can you talk more about the role of the sort of Timorese diaspora in that struggle? What sorts of activities did the diaspora engage in, and did that help or hurt the movement?
Yes, diaspora politics is a major part of internationalization strategies, right? That this becomes particularly viable if you have members of your group who live in these other countries such that they can stage a protest in Canberra, in London, in Washington, D.C., or make contacts with foreign media. So my understanding of the Timorese case is that was a major part of what they did. It's also, this is also a challenge at times. Often diaspora communities can have different goals than the resistors who are still on the ground in the country. There are many cases in which diaspora communities are actually pushing for a more violent armed option. Some argue exactly because it's easier to argue for that when you're living in another country and you won't be there to suffer the consequences. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting dynamic and worthy of greater study and thought, both in the East Timorese case as well as others. I mentioned the Madhesi protests in Nepal more recently. There's a broad Madhesi diaspora, and I know that they are wrestling with the difficulty of how to effectively utilize that diaspora. It can be very helpful in terms of reaching out to foreign media, in terms of actually carrying out tactics in other countries. At the same time, there can be challenges. Not only can the diaspora have different interests, but there's also the tension that when you're reaching out to a diaspora community, that can create backlash in your own country. It heightens the sense of this general sense of national sovereignty, of people within a country believing that local problems should be resolved locally. So that is a cost and benefit that that movements, considering an internationalization strategy, considering mobilizing the diaspora, need to wrestle with.
Great, thank you. Toward the beginning of your presentation, you talked a lot about sort of the social psychology theory of the other. Can you draw any parallels between some of these movements and more sort of contemporary modern movements? Do you think that broad coalition building is something that is ever going to become easier? Do you think that this whole notion of the other is something that's always going to be present in movements and coalition building?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't have a definitive answer because I can see forces pointing in both ways. I think in some sense forces of globalization are great, whether internationally or even within countries, are create means of exchange, a greater contact with groups that would create that should and could minimize this sense of otherness. Even just tactically, new technologies, social media, more common languages and higher literacy rates create a kind of a material pathway to at least trying to branch out, forming coalitions, engaging in dialogue with other groups that may have been more difficult in the past. On the other hand, there is this argument, not just in kind of this type of conflict thinking, but more generally of globalization creating backlashes and creating reversions to more, quote, primordial identities, that globalization tends to create winners and losers, tends to, in some contexts, exacerbate inequalities, and often a consequence of that is turning to ethnic identities to scapegoat other groups for economic suffering that one group is facing, or just generally if groups are excluded and being left behind by processes of globalization, that can further the sense of otherness. So I think it is an open question yet to be examined, or yet to be determined whether these processes are more helpful or create more barriers to nonviolent action. I guess I would say that the historical trend is that we're seeing the ratio of civil resistance to armed insurgency has kind of consistently over time moved in favor of civil resistance. So I think that would be, there may be many causes for that, but one of which could be that this is evidence of these processes that you're talking about helping groups overcome these barriers and be more successful at nonviolent action. I do think the case of Nepali Congress is one such example.
All right, great. And I think we only have time for one more question. This next question, it somewhat builds off of that last one, but this person says, it seems that all these strategies require building of relationships, especially building and bridging social capital. How do these groups build relationships across some of these divides, and what skills are important to be able to achieve this?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That to the degree that I suggest these strategies as ways of overcoming, to a certain degree, a lack of social relationships or social ties, they all require some social ties to begin with or to get started. Some strategies that I think are helpful. In terms of this, yeah, a couple of things. In terms of movement building, this idea of creating organizations that are specific to kind of sub-elements of the larger group, but that cross-cut the traditional divisions. For example, both the Maoists and the Nepali Congress Party will create women's leagues or women's organizations that bring together, focus on the specific grievances that women have in the current political environment, but bring together women from the different ethnic groups. Additionally, professional groups serve the same function. So I think that is a way of trying to help foster and promote, build these types of relationships. I think it also requires maintaining dialogue with other political actors in the system, even when you think that they are the adversary and unlikely to form an alliance with you. For a good chunk of the Maoist conflict, the Maoist history, they viewed the other political parties as their enemy number one. And it was only in the latter half of their conflict when they have this debate within their movement as to whether they should start having dialogue with these political parties. It's very contentious. One of the leaders throws the other leader under house arrest. But they eventually engage in dialogue with other political parties. For years, it's not productive. They have fundamentally different visions of what the Nepali state should look like. However, due to exogenous events, this palace massacre, this new tyrannical king, the other political parties change their political position. And they're able to, once that happens, because they were already in dialogue with the Maoists, they are able to get to the table and turn that change in political outlook into an alliance and into a ultimately successful nonviolent campaign. I think that's valuable not just from the perspective of movements, that movements should take a strategy of trying to maintain those types of, build and maintain those types of relationships and dialogues, but it is a role that external actors can play as well. External actors often swoop in after conflict has broken out, trying to create a summit of all the various actors in a conflict. We saw this in Syria. After it becomes a civil war, then the U.S. and other states get involved trying to create roundtables of all the different rebel groups. What if they had done that before it turned violent? Created a forum for different actors within Syrian society who are dissatisfied with the Assad regime. Could you have developed a more cohesive, less fragmented resistance organization that might have been less susceptible to transitioning to violence? That might be overly optimistic, but I think it is a tactic worthy of consideration.